Judaism has a very good software program for processing the experiences of dying and death.
Welcome to The Endgame by Clear Estate, life's final chapter, discussed openly. I'm Davide Pisano. In these conversations, we get real about estates and legacies and our efforts to disrupt old systems with new technology. As always, I'm joined by my co-host, Sara Hillier, the estate luminary. This is where I'm landing on this episode.
These are getting more and more creative.
Sara, thanks for taking the lead on the episode this time while I was traveling. This is the first of many episodes where we want to raise awareness of different traditions, whether they be cultural, religious, around end of life, death, and the way different people think about it. How did you enjoy that first episode?
Well, it's super informative for me personally, and hopefully for our listeners as well. I think great learnings there, and having it broken down, in a way that's kind of like digestible and approachable, easy to understand. I think is really what we accomplished.
So basically, you had Simcha Paull Raphael, who's a psychotherapist by training and a rabbinic pastor. He has worked as a death awareness educator, resident psychologist in a funeral home, grief counselor, and hospice chaplain. So basically, somebody who's thought about and is very aware of end of life topics, I would say, in the Jewish tradition. The striking thing was, etiquette and deeper ideas that I would say shape the mourning practices and process in the Jewish tradition.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, at the end of the day, grieving and, mourning, it really is a universal experience. And I think people want to know how they can show up with sensitivity for, all different cultures and religions.
Amazing. We'll listen to that conversation, and one of many coming on this podcast. Please don't forget to subscribe to The Endgame by Clear Estate on Apple, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform.
Today, we're delving into our first of many explorations into some end-of-life traditions in various cultures. We want to educate and also help you to support people in your sort of orbit who may be grieving and who you maybe don't have an awareness of what their, cultural and religious rituals and traditions are. We're starting with the Jewish faith today with a true expert who has dedicated his entire professional life to the topic, writing several books. Simcha Paull Raphael is a psychotherapist by training and a rabbinic pastor. He has worked as a death awareness educator, a resident psychologist in a funeral home, a grief counselor, and also a hospice chaplain. For over 25 years, he's offered death and dying workshops, classes, bereavement groups for adults. He's also a prolific author, including his original bestseller, Jewish Views of the Afterlife. And his latest book is Spirits, Ghosts, and the Books, Afterlife Journeys in Yiddish Love. Simcha joins us from his home in Philadelphia. Thanks so much for taking the time today to be here.
I'm glad to be here, and thank you for an introduction that would make my mother smile.
That's what we aim for. So today, this is part of a conversation that we want to, handle with care, obviously. For many listeners, these traditions may be unfamiliar, but they do want to, show up for those in their community that are going through the grieving process, which, of course, the grieving experience is universal in that we all go through it at some time where we unfortunately lose a loved one. Now, like some of my colleagues in the end-of-life planning space, we've discussed this on the podcast, people who gravitate towards these spaces often kind of have deep personal motivations. I'm told that your professional journey did begin with in childhood, and I don't want to pry, but do you mind sharing a bit of your story with us?
Well, there's a couple of vignettes that make that story what it is. When I was 4 or 5 years old, I had a very close relationship with my grandmother, and at one point she just died suddenly. And in those years, children weren't taken to funeral or Shiva, which is the ritual mourning that takes place after death. So they told me Bubby went to heaven. That was it. Mm-hmm. So I spent the next 5, 6 years of my life talking to her in heaven. I was this dreamy little kid, and then I felt a sense of my grandmother's presence very early on. So there was that, but there was also living in the shadow of grief. Okay, so that was in 1955. In 1955, my mother was 32, and both her parents were dead.
Okay. Wow.
Her father had been killed in a traffic accident when she was 10 years old. Her mother died when she was in her early 30s. So I lived not knowing, very much in the shadow of a mother who was in grief. Mm-hmm. And yet we stayed open to talking about death. My mother would often talk about her father and what it was like before he died and what it was like after he died, and would often talk about her mother. So I didn't grow up in a home where death was shoved under the carpet, where it was very, very much part of life. And then in my early 20s, my closest friend was killed in a car accident. Wow. He was with me one day. We were making plans for his funeral the next day. And again, very early on, I felt a sense of his presence. And at that point, I'd already had my degree in history and philosophy of religion from Concordia University. Even though I'm in Philadelphia, I am originally from Montreal. And nobody had ever talked about what Judaism believes about life after death. And so here I was, a kind of spiritual seeker, doing yoga, meditation, reading books about religion and philosophy, having a sense of contact with this friend of mine. He appeared to me in a dream. A number of us were sitting around after the funeral and saying, hey, didn't it feel like Les was there? So it sent me on a quest to learn what Judaism had to say about life after death. And through a number of iterations, I ended up writing my doctoral dissertation on Jewish views of death and afterlife, and then published Jewish Views of the Afterlife. And my first job after I got my doctorate was in Toronto as a resident psychologist in a Jewish funeral home at Benjamin's Park Memorial up on Steeles.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Yep. Familiar with it.
And that taught me a lot about helping people deal with dying and death.
Wow. It sounds like I think you definitely have the personal, insights that came first, and the personal experiences that then led you to kind of this whole lifelong and professional journey in the space, which is, super interesting. And like I said, a lot of folks in the space are kind of on a similar path in that they had a personal experience that motivated them. So let's talk a bit about end-of-life etiquette, and specifically in Jewish mourning. Like for listeners who, do work with grieving families or who simply want to kind of better support their friends or their colleagues or their communities, what is the first thing to understand about Jewish mourning etiquette?
Okay, well, let me step back and say it in a broad sense first. As you alluded to in your introduction, mortality is built into the human operating system. My Auntie Rose would say, everybody has their expiry date tattooed on their body. She says, mine's on my rear end. I can't see it, so don't worry about it. To which I would say, Auntie Rose, it's a good thing, because if you could see your rear end from behind, you would drop dead. Right? And Judaism has a very good software program for processing the experiences of dying and death. So that's sort of in broad strokes. The other sort of philosophical overview before we get into some of the specifics, in Judaism there's a sense that this world is holy. The goal is not so much to transcend this world, but to divinize, to make this world. To show you, I went to Hebrew school. There's a phrase in the Bible called Mamlechet Kohanim v'Goy Kadosh, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. That's a biblical quote. You shall become a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So what that means from a contemporary point of view is that our challenge is to make life imbued with a sense of the holy, not the meaninglessness. It's not to spend all your hours on Facebook and Instagram. It's to find meaning in life. Life is holy and death is holy. So our rituals are really designed to bring a sense of holiness and meaning to what sometimes seems like the meaningless of dying and death. When my 22-year-old friend was killed in a car accident, that was meaningless. It seemed random. And yet I remember he was from an Orthodox family, and they sat Shiva, which is a 7-day process of mourning somebody who has died, and they did it like full Monty. And that was the first time I was really in there, because I was there day and night, and I really saw how the rituals around mourning really became a cocoon of healing. So we have within Judaism a variety of different ritual practices, and we can go through some of them a little bit at a time. Some have to do with dying itself, and some have to do with mourning.
Okay. And so in the first, days when you're going through Shiva, is like who actually gathers and like what happens in those early days, and why does the timing matter so much?
First of all, before we go into Shiva, we have to bury somebody. A Jewish tradition that burial happens as soon as possible. You don't have a 7-day wake. So depending on, do family members have to come in from another country or from across the continent? If somebody dies on a Monday, they could be buried as early as Tuesday morning. In today's day and age, it's probably 24 to 48 hours.
Okay.
In that period, in between death and burial, people are often in a kind of zombie-like state. And Judaism understands that, and the task at that point is not even to comfort the mourner, but to help them deal with the logistics of preparing for a funeral. It's almost as if the understanding is, how could you comfort somebody when their dead are still right in front of them?
Yes,
so again,
of course.
it's very functional. The task immediately after death is to make sure that the ritual practices of preparing a body for burial take place, and the plans are in place for a funeral. The second piece that comes in place is the funeral itself. And the funeral is really designed as a communal experience. All of these rituals take place in community. So you have to have what they call a minyan. A minyan is a quorum. When I worked at a funeral home, sometimes they would call me into a funeral to help make a minyan, to help make a quorum of the right number of people. And there was one time, there was a family where there was the father had died, there was the mother, the son, and one other friend. And that was it. And we knew from a psychological point of view that this was a family in trouble. That they had lived so isolated, and they weren't from out of town. This took place in Toronto. They were living in Toronto, but they had no sense of community. We need people around to help us move through grief. That's a predominant Jewish value. The way we get it together is together.
Yeah.
Grief and mourning and death can be very isolating. So the Jewish way is to create a sense of, hey, there's got to be other people around. The body is buried, and there's a lot of specifics around that ritual, one of which is throwing dirt upon the coffin. I don't know you or any of your listeners have ever been to a Jewish funeral, but there's something very eerie when the box is lowered into the earth, and then first the family members and then the other people come up to the gravesite and throw earth on the coffin. The experience of earth hitting the box is a wake-up call to say death is real. Judaism doesn't glorify death, but it doesn't deny death. Death is very real. It's almost like, oh my God, this is really happening here.
Yeah.
In that moment of deep isolation and disconnection, in a certain sense, we align with every other person who stood at the graveside and buried a loved one.
Wow. Yes, it sounds certainly very powerful and obviously deeply rooted in community, which is, I think, everyone can relate to and understand for sure.
Absolutely. Then, when you leave the cemetery, they ask the mourners who are present, the family and friends who are present, to line up in 2 rows. And the immediate family walk through the 2 rows as if to say, we are here for you. So again, all these small little rituals are making death real and helping people see that they're in community. People leave the cemetery and you're supposed to wash your hands. Again, a sense of death is holy, but we don't want to hold on to some of the contaminants, if you will, from the cemetery. There's something called a meal of consolation. When you get from the cemetery to the house where you're sitting Shiva, and they say sitting Shiva because in a house, Shiva means 7. They use the word a Shiva house.
Okay.
You're supposed to sit on low stools.
Okay.
In some communities, they take the pillows off the couch. The first thing you do in the Shiva house is that it's called the meal of consolation, which consists of, traditionally it's hard-boiled eggs and lentils because they're both round. Again, the circle of life. Today they substitute bagels in there.
Okay.
But again, you've just buried your loved one and the community is there to feed you. You're not alone in this. And I think these rituals, or this software program, as I described it earlier, is very powerful, but many people don't know about these. I recommend a book called Saying Kaddish by Anita Diamant, Diamant.
Okay.
Again, 70 people show up and, they're talking about the Stanley Cup game, they're talking about the weather, but really they want to give family members a chance to talk about their loved ones. I encourage people to put out a little tableau of photographs, to bring out some albums. When I worked at at the funeral home, Michael Benjamin would give people a family tree to fill out during the Shiva house. That's the time who are the ancestors? They say Jacob was gathered to his father. He was buried with his ancestors. Who are the ancestors that one is connecting with in their death? So again, all of these small aspects of the rituals really help people deal with dying and death. So Shiva takes place, it's 7 days. Some people reduce it to 3 days, which is actually an oxymoron, because Shiva means 7. So you can't have 3 days Shiva. But it's really a chance for people to tell stories about loved ones. People bring in food so you're taken care of. And there are traditional prayers that are said during the Shiva period as well.
And if you're a non-Jewish friend or colleague, how do you know, whether you should visit or, if you should send food? Like, do you give space? Like, what's the best way for you to show your support?
Show up.
Yeah.
Show up. If it's somebody who with whom you have a meaningful relationship, it means a lot to show up You don't have to worry about bringing food. There's so much food that's already there. Don't bring flowers. Don't send flowers.
Okay.
Often they'll in an obituary it'll say, in lieu of flowers, make a contribution to Cancer Society or the Parkinson's group or whatever was meaningful for that person's life and
Yeah.
death. And my own practice is not going to a Shiva house hungry. I don't feel like the food is for me as a supportive friend. The food is really for the mourners. So go when it's quiet. Just offer your condolences. If you knew the person's loved one and you have a memory or something, I remember your father was always very welcoming when I came into your house. It was when we were younger, or I never told you this story, but this and this happened between me and your spouse or whatever. So share a memory, offer your condolences, and leave.
Yeah.
You don't have to. You don't have to stick around. You don't have to stick around. I mean, I remember, and this was in the 70s. Some woman, bless her soul, was talking about her microwave because microwaves were new in 50 years ago, and then it got silent, and then she started talking about her microwave again. So there is a kind of anxious tension sometimes in the silence. But don't be afraid to sit in silence. The other thing in terms of people going to a Shiva house is a lot of Shivas these days are also taking place on Zoom, right? Since COVID, we've really changed a lot of these practices. So you can go sit Shiva with somebody who is 500 miles away. I mean, that's one of
huge.
the blessing legacies. Again, my brother-in-law died not that long ago. There was standing room only at his funeral, but there were also hundreds of people on Zoom for the funeral. So if you can't show up, keep your camera on. They'll often say, "Does anybody have a memory? Does anybody have a story?"
And I think these are all, thank you for explaining all of that. I think all of it has very clear, logic, and the symbols, everything makes, great sense. And I think it's actually, based on what you've explained, it's not difficult for folks who are maybe, outside of the community to come in and show their support and their care and help to kind of be a part of that, community grieving environment. I'm wondering, like, are there any key phrases that are kind of typical? Like I've heard of, may their memory be a blessing, for example. Like, are there any kind of comfort expressions that are particular used here?
In terms of particular phrases, may their memory be a blessing. It always sounds good. Sometimes people have died and their memory is they were a pain in the ass. So that's a whole other topic of conversation.
Yeah, we usually don't lead with that.
We don't, right. Actually, it's interesting. The traditional greeting when you leave a Shiva house, from the Hebrew gets translated into English, may you be comforted among the mourners of Zion and Israel. Like, may you be recognized as being part of a greater community. I always add, may you be comforted among the mourners of Zion, Israel, and North York, or Zion and Israel and Côte Saint Luc, or whatever it is. So that's an Anita Diamond's book called Saint Kaddish would have that in there. When you leave, listen, may their memory be a blessing. The other thing is, Shiva it's good to make a Shiva call, but it's even better to make a phone call 4 weeks later and say, hey, I'm thinking of you, how you doing? People show up a lot for the funeral and the Shiva, and then the mourners are dealing with the paperwork of the death certificate and looking around for the password to be able to get into their computer and all of those kind of things, which people in you're talking about estate planning, they need to make sure they have all of their passwords written down in one place,
of course.
for their investment firms, for their Facebook, for their computer. All of that stuff is really, really important. I don't know whether you have specific forms for that to be able to do, but it reminds me I need to update all of mine.
Yeah, absolutely. We do. We do have a way to do that in our platform for sure for our customers.
Can I tell a story?
Of course. Please do.
This is to lead into the ongoing process of mourning. My teacher, Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalom, he tells a story about how when he got up from Shiva, if you sit Shiva, you get up from Shiva.
Okay.
And he was driving on the highway and somebody cut him off. And he rolled down his window, and we still had windows that rolled down, and he let out a string of curses in Polish. His father was an old Polish Jew. He was a driving he was a driving salesman, and he would go around cursing out the window all the time. And he said he stopped his car, and he said, "You know what, Papa? That one you can have back." And he says the work of a child mourning a parent in particular is to be able to say, this one I got from you, and this one I'm going to keep. And that one, I had to deal with your craziness when you're alive, and that one you can have back. So I often tell this story when I talk with somebody right after a funeral or during the Shiva to say, may you be able to harvest the good stuff that you got from your father or from your mother or from a brother and let go of all the other stuff.
Yeah.
That's an ongoing process.
Yeah, it's a great story, and I think it's and also acknowledging, the what you're going to, choose what you take and leave the rest. It makes absolute sense. Kind of shifting to ideas behind the rituals, and you alluded to this just now, but is there like a particular understanding of grief that's something that happens in, stages or phases rather than something that you're just, supposed to get over?
First, I'll start with the traditional Jewish paradigm, if you will, and then I'll look at it. I'll bring in my other yarmulke, so to speak, as a psychologist. So there's that period of time prior to burial. There's burial, there's Shiva. Following Shiva, there's something called Kaddish. Kaddish is a ritual prayer that is said, for a parent it's said 11 months, for other family members it's said for 30 days.
Okay.
So there's an acknowledgement of a kind of ongoing durative process. There's also something called shloshim. Shloshim means 30. So the first 30 days are regarded as like an intermezzo zone where you're still hyper involved in the grief. Like people say, it took me a while to realize that, like I was in a zombie state.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the wife, I said my brother-in-law died not that long ago. His wife, my sister-in-law, died 2 years later. So I have two nephews in their 30s who are both parentless children. And I said to them, you're still in shock. The grief is going to come later. They're still in shock, and they're dealing with all of the logistical stuff of the finances that are left behind, or my sister-in-law was involved in all kinds of community activities. They needed to know what she was doing, and there were family business stuff and that.
Right.
So they're still in that zombie phase. It says 30 days, but it could be when there's a sudden death, it takes a lot longer. It takes a lot.
That makes sense.
What people need to know is in the early phases, there may be more shock than there is grief and mourning. So these Jewish rituals are designed to take somebody from the initial shock or shock and denial into a gentle acceptance of death. So the model that I use is, first there's accepting the shock and denial, which is you need to accept the reality of death. Then there's facing the painful truth. That's when the SH hits the fan. That's when there's a lot of tears and anger
Yes.
and upset. And that's experiencing the pain of grief. Then there's putting the pieces together. It's like slowly moving forward. And that's sort of one step at a time, beginning to readjust, beginning to change. And then there's adjusting to a reality, to a new reality. And so that's sort of initiating new processes. And so to continue, go back to the Jewish stuff, so then we have the anniversary, we have the unveiling, which is putting up a monument, which takes place anywhere between 9 and 12 and 15 months after the death. And then there's memorial prayers that are said 4 times a year and the anniversary of a death. So the Jewish system is really designed to take people through a gradated process. And I think this is the important thing, the first thing that determines it depends on the circumstances of death. Is it a young person who has died? Is it somebody who died suddenly? Was it a violent death? Was it a messy death? My father also died suddenly. He was overweight his whole life. I say, Daddy, you get your exercise reaching for the cake. So when he died, I was shocked. He had a massive heart attack and he died. He was 86, which wasn't so bad for a fat guy. But I wasn't surprised. I was shocked, but I wasn't surprised.
Right.
So I think that the circumstances around the death determine how people grieve. And some people, I think the overriding principle that Judaism prescribes is death is real. We don't want to hide it. We don't want to glorify it. We don't have a sense of, oh, now he's with Jesus. That's not in the Jewish way. That's not in the Jewish way. It's more like there's sadness and they're on some other journey into the world beyond. And that leads to another whole topic of conversation, perhaps.
Yes, absolutely. I think it's interesting and fascinating to me. Like I love hearing about all of this and learning. And it sounds a lot like, the rituals and the practices are very much grounded in reality and also in accommodating the real life, experience that folks are having through grieving, which is super important because, as you said, of course it's sad, every time we lose someone, but the circumstances do make it different and therefore make the grieving process different as well.
Right. If it's the first parent, it's one thing. If it's a second parent, is the family intact? Do the siblings talk to each other?
Yeah.
Are they disconnected from each other? Is there other family around? Was it a messy death in the hospital? I mean, I had a client who was miserable because her father experienced a really horrific death in the hospital. Somebody I know had to take the parent off life support.
Yeah.
Those kind of things are very, very difficult.
Very difficult. But it also seems like, a lot of people outside of that, that are non-Jewish could probably benefit from having some of these, thought processes involved when they're grieving. So super fascinating and important to share. I'm curious if you could maybe talk a little bit about what is the particular understanding of kind of like the soul and, a person's kind of dignity around the soul after they pass away? Like, are there thoughts on that? Or
I have a lot of thoughts on that. Okay. Life after death in Judaism. If we had a room full of 100 people who were and were not raised Jewishly, and I said, what do Jews believe in life after death? You would see a room full of blank faces. The word on the block is Jews' belief in the life and the living, not so much in the hereafter. It turns out it's true, but it's only half true. Judaism believes in life and the living. This world is very real. We do our mitzvot, our commandments in this world. We observe the Sabbath in this world. And at the end of time and history, it's not to transcend and go to another heavenly realm as much as to really build this as like I said, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, make this world holy. But that doesn't mean the Jews don't believe in life after death. In the pre-modern world, in the world of the Kabbalistic masters of the Middle Ages and the Hasidic Rebbes, in the world of the Yiddish folk writers, Fiddler on the Roof is an afterlife tale. So in the pre-modern world, there was never any question about life after death. But with scientific materialism, and with psychoanalysis, what's his name? Simcha Freud said that standing in front of dead bodies, human beings invented spirits and ghosts. So the intellectual worldview of the early 20th century was a sort of secular humanism. So Jews lost touch with that. And my work has been, I've been calling it these days spiritual archaeology. My teacher said, go back into the earlier periods and you'll begin to find a lot of different information on life after death. So the first thing I want to say is that yes, Judaism does believe in life after death. Jewish Views of the Afterlife or Afterlife and the Grief Journey are two books that you can get a little bit of that. So then the question is, okay, Simcha, I heard you wrote a book on life after death. What did you learn? It's fascinating that there's a really strong correlation of the stages of the grief journey and Jewish rituals and the afterlife material. So one quote that it comes out of medieval Jewish mysticism. It says, for 7 days the soul goes back and forth from his home to the grave, mourning for the body. And I read that and I go, oh my God, wow. What it means, again, whether or not one believes in soul or afterlife is a different story. I'm not saying you have to believe. I'm not selling belief, but I will sell you my books if you go to my website, right, or Amazon.com. But at least as a Jewish scholar now, I want people to understand. So there is this notion of a kind of intermezzo phase right after death. Right? For 7 days, the soul goes back and forth from his home to his former grave, meaning the soul can potentially be around during the Shiva. And one ritual I didn't mention, at the end of the Shiva, it's traditional for the mourners to walk around the block.
Okay.
In a psychological sense, you get up from Shiva, you walk around the block as if to say, I'm going back into my life now. But in a spiritual sense, it's as if to say to the soul, we're going to walk you this far, and now you have to go the rest of the way on your own.
Wow. Okay.
There's this intermezzo phase where the soul sticks around. Then there's another tradition of saying Kaddish. Now it says that the soul goes through what they call Gehenna. Gehenna is sort of like, it's not quite hell. There's no eternal damnation in Judaism. It's like purgatory. It's like... the old model is like the penal colony. The new model is like going to rehab.
Okay.
You need some time. The bereaved person needs some time to process the incomplete karma, if you will, between the person who died and the living person. So as a child to a parent, it's like, you know what, I could forgive you for that. I remember that time you really lost it with me. Or I've worked with people who had a parent who was a raging alcoholic, and they have to make peace with that. They have to make peace with it. So there seems to be a period of time where the soul has to go through its own refinements, if you will.
Okay.
Then there's the heavenly Garden of Eden, not unlike our heavenly descriptions. They say that there are 7 realms of the heavenly Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden. So it depends on how much you've put into your spiritual bank account, whether you're going to get a Motel 6 or a Best Western or a Hilton or an apartment on the Riviera. And then there's another place where the soul goes back to in preparing for reincarnation. So I'm giving you all of this in very, very broad strokes. But I think the main thing for this conversation is Jews do believe in life after death. And between this world and the world beyond is a window and not a wall. And in moments of silent meditation, prayer, dreams, and synchronistic meanings, the window opens. That traditional cultures throughout the ages always had a sense that there was a connection with the ancestors, and we've lost touch with that. But if I can say anything that people could take with them, pay attention to those kind of meaningful moments, because those ancestors are always there, and after a while they're around to guide us. They're around to guide us.
This is, I think, in my experience of working, for almost 2 decades in the estate planning and estate settlement space, I've heard hundreds of stories about the connections that you're talking about. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Like almost everyone has some sort of story of some sort of sign or some sort of connection, something that even oftentimes makes sense, really only to them. Like it may not make sense
That's right.
to others. Like the connection is unique in that way. So I think it's a beautiful thing. And thank you for explaining all of that. Breaking it down for us, that was quite easy to understand, absolutely, and relate to. I do want to ask specifically about a popular sort of topic that I hear come up is just around ethical wills. And I think maybe a lot of people don't really know what that is. So could you maybe take a few moments to explain?
Yeah. There's a tradition in Judaism of someone towards the end of their life making some kind of statement. In the book of Genesis, Jacob, he says, "Behold, I'm about to die," and he doesn't deny it. He says, "Behold, I'm about to die," and he speaks to each of his children, and some of them he chews out, and some of them he gives a blessing, and so that's sort of said to be like the first known ethical will. There was a book appeared many years ago called Hebrew Ethical Wills. It was a gathering of all of these last testaments that people wrote. In the medieval period, be sure to remember to say your prayers and give money to tzedakah, take on social justice causes. And today, again, you can go to Rabbi Google and ask about it, Jewish ethical wills, and you can get guidelines for how to write an ethical will. So the ethical will is, this was my life, this is what was meaningful to me, and this is what I want you to remember. And these days, people can do that on a video. When I would teach undergraduates death and dying, I would say, when you go home to your parents on American Thanksgiving, sit with your grandparents and put them in front of your iPhone and ask them questions about their life. So I would say, if you would include it as part of your estate planning, what is it that you want people to know about you? What is it that you want to say? What are the blessings? Johnny, be sure to take care of be good to your sister, and floss your teeth and give money to the American Red Cross or whatever it is. These are the values I live by, and I hope that you will take on some of them. So whether you want to do it as a video or a written one, if you can, leave behind an ethical will.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a wonderful thing, and something that like everyone is kind of talking about, maybe not in the context of Jewish traditions, but it's something that I think is top of mind for everyone now, is kind of thinking more about my values, my core beliefs, and kind of making sure that that's part of your legacy, and it's not just all about your financial assets and tying up the paperwork, right? Which is super important.
Legacy work, and I think, just again to step back, and what the deeper question is, what's the message that you want to pass on? Talking openly about your own mortality. Sometimes the kids don't want to deal with that.
Mm-hmm.
I'll say to somebody, what do you mean you don't have a living will? You live too long to die young. It's taking these traditions, these values, this attitude towards dying and death that comes out of Jewish tradition and other traditions as well in different ways, and being culturally radical. Talking openly about dying and death is culturally radical. This conversation, when you think about it, is culturally radical because people would rather sweep the SH under the rug and not talk about it. But but to be conscious, to do your estate planning, not only your 401k and what your RRSPs. I could be Canadian, right?
Yeah.
But your value system, your meaning. We didn't even talk about making sure you have your burial plans in order.
Right.
Is there a particular poem or song you want played at your funeral? Let people
Yes.
know that. Being proactive in your own end of life preparation is I think the meta message in our conversation here today.
Yeah, absolutely. And your latest book is called Spirits, Ghosts, and Die Books. Am I saying that
Dybbuk.
correctly? Dybbuk.
Dybbuk.
Okay, thank you. And it's about, afterlife journeys. Like, does this mean, like, does that mean ghosts? Like, is it akin to ghosts, or can you tell me a little bit more
Okay.
for those of us not familiar?
So I wrote Jewish Views of the Afterlife I wrote it as my doctoral dissertation in the 80s. I turned it into a book in the 90s. And at that point, what I wrote in that book was that with modernity, with the Enlightenment and scientific materialism, Jewish views of the afterlife disappeared. After I published that book, I realized that wasn't quite the case, that views of life after death continued in the secular literature of the Yiddish writers. Yiddish was a dialect of Middle High German that emerged in the 1600s, 1700s, and that whole area, what they call the Pale of the Settlement, Russia, Ukraine, Lithuania, that was the mother tongue of the Jewish world. Around the 1700s and going forward, there develops a whole genre of Yiddish literature that's not religious texts per se. Jewish Views of the Afterlife looked at religious texts over 3,000 years. In the secular literature, there's all kinds of stories about Dybbuk The Exorcist. Remember the movie The Exorcist?
Yeah.
It's a possessing spirit. Yes, the ghosts are more like spirits that come back to say hello. More of them. The Dybbuks are the malevolent spirits. There are benign spirits that come around, and then there's reincarnation tales. So, what I did in my most recent book is I went back to the genre of Yiddish literature from that period of time, from Eastern Europe, and then some are written in English in America after some of the Yiddish authors migrated into American culture, and I present a whole lot of these stories to show that we still have these notions of survival after death. And what they do is they take the traditional stuff and they mix it in with sort of socio-political ideas that are emerging with sort of the socialist movements of the early 1900s. So there's one story about the sinners in Gehenna, this world of purgatory, are arguing for better living conditions, which is very much sort of the early labor movements were doing the exact same thing. So it's a fun little book.
I'm curious to know, obviously, you're clearly an expert on these topics. Of all
I've read a lot of books. I think
Yes.
we're all we're all dealing with the reality of dying and death.
Yes, and with all of the things that you've researched and you've learned over the years and kind of your professional experiences, like what would you say is the most kind of like surprising thing, or the thing that's the most kind of people, are maybe the least aware of, or the thing you personally found the most surprising?
Well, what's surprising to me is how pervasive is this view that Jews don't believe in life after death. That's
Hmm.
both surprising and annoying. Though I think I've shifted the bar a little bit over 25 years and that. I think the other thing is just how extensive are these views about life after death. They're, and people don't know about them.
Hmm.
I mean, Jewish Views of the Afterlife is 490 pages.
Wow.
It's in a third 25th anniversary edition. There's another book that I want to mention called May the Angels Carry You, Jewish Prayers and Meditations for the Deathbed, and reflections, stories for people to be able to read to somebody or to help them deal with that. Afterlife and the Grief Journey, Jewish Pastoral Care for Bereavement, again, a short book on afterlife and Jewish death rituals. And another one, Musings with the Angel of Death. I'm trying to remember the subtitle, but it's my grief poetry.
Okay, that's great. I will definitely be doing checking out some of the things you've mentioned that you yourself have published, as well as some of the other books that you mentioned. So I have some homework, as do some of our listeners probably. But I do have one last question, and it's just relating to how you think about your own legacy and your own kind of end of life planning. And we talked about how it seems like this is it's an uncomfortable topic for folks, and that's what we're saying, why it's hard for them to come to terms with even having the conversations. And we've talked about that a ton on our podcast, how difficult it is to really have these conversations and kind of face your own demise. Nobody really wants to do that, understandably. But how do you approach it? Like, how do you think of your own legacy and your end of life planning? And of course, I have to ask, do you have your estate plan, up to date? Because obviously that's what we do here at Clear Estate.
Well, I have a living will, I have an ethical will, and I've done funeral planning.
Okay.
And funeral planning can be complex. My parents are buried in Montreal. It's too cold. I don't want to hang out in the cold Montreal winter. My wife is from Knoxville, Tennessee. There's only
Okay.
one Jewish cemetery in Knoxville, and her parents, her grandparents, and even her great grandparents are buried there.
Wow. Okay.
So we have plots and we've made arrangements for our
Hmm.
burial there,
Hmm.
but we live here in Philadelphia. So I also had to make arrangements locally,
Hmm.
assuming I would be in Philadelphia at the end of my life, and which is a possibility but never guaranteed. So
Right.
that this is where our children are right now. This is where we would have played out many years of our lives. So we've made arrangements to have some kind of service here, and then to be shipped off to Knoxville. And there were a whole lot of different considerations about that. Could we do a green burial? Do we need a casket? I mean, I've really
Hmm.
thought about some of these things.
Wow.
After my brother-in-law died 2 years ago, I said to my wife, we need to get this in place.
Yeah.
The other thing that is really not quite on the death and dying topic, but very much on the death and dying topic, the boomers have the largest historical passing on of useless crap than any other generation. The number of times I'm teaching a class in death and dying, and what people are talking about is going through their stuff.
Hmm.
And I am totally guilty because my wife and I are collectors, and we have hundreds and hundreds of religious artifacts and pictures, and
Hmm.
thousands of books, and we're slowly trying to winnow down, but it's a long process, and that's a big deal
Yes.
That's a big deal. So I hope to live long enough to at least be able to get out of this almost 4,000 foot square home, and as a matter of fact, in 2 weeks I'm going to an open house at a place that has independent living, assisted living, and skilled nursing, where
Wow.
a number of our contemporaries are slowly migrating there. It's in the Philadelphia area. So I'm thinking about this all the time.
Okay. You've thought about quite a lot of things,
Yeah.
which is, of course, I mean, I expected nothing less. And I think it is definitely of particular importance if you are of a faith where there are these, rituals and traditions that you want to be respected and followed, that you actually take the time to plan so that the logistics and practical aspects of it will actually work, right? Because as difficult as the grieving process already is, it's even more difficult if you're then also scrambling, to be respectful of rituals and traditions and timelines and things like that. So it's great that you've thought about the logistics, and it's also something that I think is becoming more and more important, because, in 2026, families are more international than
Scattered,
they ever
yeah.
have been, right? So super important in thinking that through. And probably one of the last things you want to see families kind of fight over is, what should happen, and where should, the person actually be situated at the end of the day.
Or whether you do cremation or not. That's a whole other kettle of fish.
Exactly. So it's great that you have spent so much time and effort in thinking those logistics through, and also sharing with your family and discussing with your family.
Be proactive. Is there first of all, if you're going to have a rabbi, is there a rabbi you know, or are you going to leave it
Yes.
up to the funeral home to decide?
Yeah.
Do you make sure you have your burial plans in place and people know where to access that. And I mean, I say to my wife, I want to do this at the funeral. She says, write it down, write it down, write it down, write it down.
Yes.
Right. So, I mean, I'm crazy on this matter because I think about this all the time. You remember Star Wars, Obi-Wan Kenobi, you're my only hope. So I'm hoping to live long enough for the technology to be there so I could read a poem at my own funeral that's a
Of course.
holographic representation. Or, tie-dye my burial shrouds, tie-dye them, not just have them white. So
one day.
I'm working on all
Hopefully
that.
soon. Yeah.
So be proactive. Let people
proactive,
know what you
absolutely.
want. Talk to your kids about it. Talk to your spouse about it. Write down what you want. Because ain't none of us getting out of here alive. So you may as well enjoy the ride while we're here and plan accordingly.
Absolutely. And one last thing too on the personal effects, just because I think that's a super important one as well, is absolutely like, as the daughter of boomers, who same boat as your children are when it comes to that. The reality is different generations perceive the value of physical things maybe differently, and trends.
Well, you grew up with this. It's my iPhone. It's all in your
Exactly.
hands. So what do you need a library for? What do you need a phone book for? Right?
Exactly. And meanwhile, that's not to say that it's not valid, that those things are, meaningful to you or to folks, but it just, practically speaking, like, can they even never mind take everything and have a physical space for it, but also just have the time to go through it, right?
That's right.
So it is a gift to start to kind of go through things and think about that in advance, for sure. So I will just end by saying thank you so much for being with us today. It has been absolutely fascinating to hear from you, and we really appreciate the explanations and the details that you provided, and certainly shared in a way that I think is easy for our listeners to digest. So thank you again so much for being here.
Great. You're a great conversationalist. I enjoyed this myself a lot.
Wonderful.
Sara, that was super interesting. What did we learn? Like, what's your key takeaway?
Well, I think like at the end of the day, being able to have some form of understanding, especially if it's, not a culture that you're part of, is going to be super helpful for folks, both professionals who are kind of, interacting with folks that are in the grieving process, but also just for, as a member of your community, to have some awareness of what are the typical, traditions and customs and rituals that folks are going that are doing as part of the mourning process, and how important those rituals are to them, and a lot of the explanations, were very grounded in kind of like logic and, practical thoughts around what happens after someone passes away, that are very easy to understand, once you take a little bit of time to dive in like we did today. So I think the key things are just to, understand that just showing up is the most important thing, and that, you can, with a little bit of knowledge and awareness, show up sensitively, not be kind of like intimidated, right? Because like we said off the top, it is a universal experience for everybody. And they just want to be supported, I think, is the main thing, right?
When you look at the framing here, where, traditions and rituals really become infrastructure, correct? Like care
Yeah.
infrastructure. And so it's not about the words, it's not about the feelings, it's almost about the process. And the process, is there for a reason, and
Yeah.
it's time tested. And
Yeah.
that's also part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And like at the end of the day, whether you're part of the culture or not part of the culture, you're part of the community if you're, around that person. And so you just want to be able to show your support. And I think it's also okay if you're not sure exactly how to do it. You may have to, ask some questions, but ultimately, at the end of the day, you're just wanting to make sure that those folks feel supported.
This idea of structure versus sympathy, I mean, not versus, but you can have both. This is something that's kind of like, as an insight, applicable to everybody.
Yeah.
And you see it sometimes, like people will grieve and they'll just fall back into doing, like doing
Yeah.
process, doing whatever, doing, just going through the motions, because it takes your mind off of something. That's kind of like a universal thing.
Yeah. I'll be interested to, as we go through more in the series, see some of the nuances between, some of the rituals in different religions and cultures. But I think I'm, going to take a wild guess here that a lot of it is just rooted in, community and feeling like you're a part of the community, and the practical needs that are, immediately following someone's passing.
And I think for professionals in general, so even professionals in the space, but also, one insight is for employers as well. Even in the secular world, traditions play a large role, especially in kind of end of life. And I think that's, awareness, or at least sensitivity, needs to be part of how we handle these things. And I think that came through from your conversation. Don't forget to share and subscribe to The Endgame by Clear Estate on Apple, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform. Sara, thank you so much for handling that. It was
My pleasure.
Brilliantly done. Thank you.
ThinkBait. TNKR Media. Good talk.